Fire, primitive tools, weaving and pottery, building and transport, trade and finance. These are the foundations of industry. And today, we're going to look at the first of these, fire. Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're back on volume 1, and we're looking at the fourth section of the first volume, and that's called the Foundations of Industry. And the first foundation of industry is fire. And this is what Durant has to say at the beginning of this section. I'm going to read it to you now. If man began with speech, and civilization with agriculture, industry began with fire. Man did not invent it. Probably nature produced the marvel for him by the friction of leaves or twigs, a stroke of lightning, or a chance union of chemicals. Man merely had the saving wit to imitate nature and to improve upon her. So for Durant, our first introduction to fire was rather haphazard. But if we're going to understand this section of the book more thoroughly, we really need to outline some basic facts about fire. In this video, we're going to look at what is fire, how was it understood historically, how did we harness it, both actual and mythological explanations, what are its uses, and what impact has it had upon civilization. So what is fire? A basic definition could be something like this. Fire is the visible effect of a rapid oxidation reaction, combustion, where a fuel reacts with an oxidizer, usually oxygen, releasing heat, light, and gases, and often produces flames. If you look at this definition, we have three related but distinct concepts. We have combustion, we have fire, and we have flames. And if you want to understand fire, you really need to understand the difference between these three concepts. And so we'll go through them in turn. First, we have combustion. Combustion is an exothermic chemical reaction whereby a combustible material or fuel, usually something carbon-based like wood or charcoal or coal, reacts with an oxidant. Second, we have fire. Fire is the physical manifestation of the chemical process of combustion. It produces heat and light. And finally, there are flames. Flames are the visible part of fire that produce light. Flames mostly contain carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrogen, unburned hydrocarbons, and soot. The color of flames can vary, and these variations can tell you something about both the chemical reaction that's taking place, as well as the temperature of the fire. For example, yellow flames have a temperature of between 1000 and 1200 Celsius. You can usually see yellow flames when you burn wood. Blue flames, on the other hand, indicate a hotter temperature, approximately 1400 to 1600 Celsius. And you can usually see blue flames with a gas stove. And white flames indicate that the temperature is hotter still, usually above 2400 Celsius. This is where we get the phrase that something is white hot. One of the interesting things about these three concepts is how they relate to each other. So we can say, for example, that not all combustions lead to fire, but all fires are a form of combustion, just as not all fires lead to flames, but all flames are a form of fire. The modern way of understanding fire is usually through the concept of the fire triangle. Just as we had three related but distinct concepts before, we had combustion, fire, and flames. This time we have three things that are necessary in order for a fire to exist. And each one of these three makes up one side of the triangle. So these three are oxygen, fuel, and heat. And if any one of those three is absent, then the fire will either not exist or will be extinguished. Let's take each one of these in turn. So the first one is oxygen. For a fire to occur, you need oxygen. Our current atmosphere is about 21% oxygen, just under 21% oxygen. And for combustion to occur, you need at least 15% oxygen. Really? It's interesting to consider then that as far as we know, Earth is the only place where fire has ever been possible. None of the other planets in our solar system have oxygen levels in their atmospheres that are above 15%, and so they wouldn't have been able to sustain combustion. And even for the vast majority of Earth's history, oxygen levels weren't high enough to have fire. So even though there would have been other types of oxidation going on, even after the Great Oxidation Event, oxygen levels would have only risen gradually over hundreds of millions of years. And so Only when we get to the late Precambrian would it have been possible to have sustained combustion here on Earth. So for more than 90% of Earth's history, there would have been no fire here on Earth. The necessity of oxygen for a fire is the reason why if you cover a fire with a blanket and it runs out of oxygen, the fire will be extinguished. Conversely, if you increase the amount of oxygen that the fire has access to, you can increase the intensity and the heat of a fire. This is what they do in industry. Strong winds are often associated with strong fires, and this is because the wind will replace the oxygen that the fire needs to maintain itself, but the wind will also spread the flames and the embers from the fire in different directions, and sometimes it spreads them in directions towards a new fuel source, which will, if it reaches its ignition point, start to burn, spreading the fire in different directions. The second part of the fire triangle is fuel. As I said earlier, fuels are usually carbon-based, things like coal, charcoal, firewood, gasoline, kerosene, things like this. Just as the oxygen level in the air impacts the fire, so the moisture level in the fuel impacts the ability of that fuel to burn. Fires require dry fuels. If the moisture level in the fuel rises above 30%, then usually that fuel will not burn. However, if you can get the fuel to burn, then one of the main components that starts to break down is cellulose. Cellulose, once it breaks down, releases flammable gases, and these flammable gases will help to continue the process of combustion. The type of fuel that you use, as well as the amount of water vapor that's in the fuel, will affect the color of the smoke. So if you want to produce thicker and more visible smoke for signaling over long distances, for example, then you would be well advised to use damp leaves or damp wood. This will usually do the trick. The third part of the fire triangle is heat. Now, heat can be both the cause of and caused by the fire. Let me explain how this process works. So every fuel has its own ignition point. And once you raise the temperature to reach the ignition point, then the fuel will begin to burn. And this will release flammable gases, things like methane, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, things like this. And that process is called pyrolysis in solids and vaporization in liquids. These gases will then mix with oxygen to maintain the fire. And the byproducts of the fire, of course, is the release of heat and light. Now, if that heat then raises nearby fuels up to their ignition points, then they will catch fire, and then they will begin to release these gases, which will maintain the fire, creating a feedback loop. So in this way, heat is both the cause of and caused by the fire. The ignition point is the minimum point at which a fuel can catch fire and sustain combustion. The ignition point will differ depending on the type of materials. Here are some approximate ignition points for various materials. Now, obviously, it will depend to a certain extent on the condition of the materials. So matches have an approximate ignition point of 180 Celsius, candles 200 Celsius, paper 220 Celsius, and wood has an approximate ignition point of 300 Celsius. One of the slight annoyances that I have in my life is when I hear people say, they come up with this proverb, there's no smoke without fire. You hear this all the time, there's no smoke without fire, which seems to mean if somebody is gossiping about you, it must be true, which I don't I don't think logically follows. But the phrase seems to me to be both literally and figuratively false, in the sense that you absolutely can have a form of smoldering combustion that produces smoke without producing any flames. So you absolutely can have smoke without fire. And it's both literally false and also, I think, metaphorically false, in the sense that people absolutely can be accused of committing crimes that they didn't commit. So they can be falsely accused. So it doesn't seem to work either in a literal sense or a metaphorical sense. And so I don't really understand it, and I've never understood why people use this phrase, but they do. And so I can only assume that I must be missing something. But yeah, that's just one of the things that kind of annoys me sometimes when I hear this. And I'm like, I don't think that works. Anyway, let's forget about all that. Let's get back to Durant and the fourth section of the first volume. So obviously the word fire is part of the English language, and that English language is part of the Germanic language family, which goes all the way back ultimately to Proto-Indo-European, as does Greek and Latin. So the Greek word for fire is, of course, pyre, and we find that in the English language in words like pyrotechnics and pyromaniac and things like this. The Latin for fire is, of course, ignis, and we find this word cropping up in the English language with something like the word ignite. We also find Latin-derived words in the English language in other areas too. So if you think of something like igneous rock is the kind of rock that forms when you have the cooling of molten magma and lava. And so igneous rocks could be thought of in some sense as something like fire rocks. If we now have some appreciation of what fire is, how was fire understood and categorized historically? What's interesting about this question is that it seems that multiple civilizations in different parts of the world, so ancient Mesopotamia, ancient India, ancient China, all drew somewhat similar conclusions about fire. They all observed natural phenomena, in this case fire, and they categorized it as one of the fundamental elements of nature. Usually these civilizations had fire as one of four fundamental elements of nature. In ancient Greece, it was the pre-Socratics who first decided to categorize fire. For the pre-Socratics, there was an important question, and that was, what is the fundamental substance of the world, or what is the beginning substance of the world? The arche. In English, you'd spell that A-R-C-H-E. Different pre-Socratic philosophers came up with different answers to this question. So Thales, for example, came up with the answer that the fundamental substance of the world was water. Anaximenes decided that the fundamental substance was air. And Heraclitus decided that the fundamental substance of the world was fire. Not much of the work of the pre-Socratics has survived. We have just fragments. But here is Heraclitus and two important fragments on the subject of fire. So this is from fragment 30. This world, which is the same for all, no one of gods or men has made. But it was ever, is now, and ever shall be an everlasting fire, with measures of it kindling and measures of it going out. And fragment 64, where Heraclitus says this, it is the thunderbolt that steers the course of all things. It's important to note that in this context, thunderbolt is almost always interpreted as being synonymous with fire. For Heraclitus, the ever-changing nature of the flames also represents the world. So somehow the world is both constantly changing but also staying the same. So for him, the world is constantly in flux. Nevertheless, for us, in the context of classifying fire, the most important pre-Socratic philosopher is Empedocles. It is to Empedocles that the West owes the concept of the four fundamental elements of nature. Those four fundamental elements being earth, water, air, and fire. For Empedocles, everything that existed was some combination of these four elements. And so if you have the transformation of something, it simply represented the reconstruction of these four elements into some kind of new combination. If legend is to be believed, then Empedocles became particularly familiar with the element of fire when he decided to throw himself into the flames of the active volcano at Mount Etna. Some people are particularly dedicated to their work. About 100 years after Empedocles' death, it was Aristotle who formalized the four elements and placed fire on a nascent scientific basis. To each of the four elements, he added two sensible qualities. The two sensible qualities he added to each element were arranged thus. So earth was cold and dry, water was cold and wet, air was hot and wet, and fire was hot and dry. By adding these two sensible qualities, Aristotle was able to explain the transformation of things. So, for example, why would water transform into steam? Well, the quality that has changed between water and air is that coldness has turned into hotness, and when you heat up water, you get steam. Another example of this would be, why would something transform from the element of air to the element of fire? Well, the quality that has changed is that something has gone from being wet to being dry. And as we know, if a fuel dries out, it's more likely to burn. The power of this four-element system is that it seemed to be able to explain why it is that natural phenomena behave the way that they do. You'll also note here that Aristotle is combining physical, biological, and perceptual phenomena into one system. Now, this may seem like very flawed reasoning to us, But at the time, this four-element system represented a major breakthrough in our ability to understand the world. The four elements also crop up in unusual places too. So, for example, in the history of medicine, for more than 2,000 years, it was believed that ill health represented an imbalance of humors. And each one of these humors is represented by one of the elements. So, earth is represented by black bile, water is represented by phlegm, air is represented by blood, and fire is represented by yellow bile. Each one of these humors was supposedly caused by one of the organs in the body, and so if you wanted to have good health, you had to balance out these different humors. These four elements have also been symbolically interpreted. They've been anthropomorphized and endowed with human characteristics or emotional states. So, for example, earth represents stability and foundation. Water represents emotion and intuition. Air is represented by intellect and communication. And fire represents passion and energy. This is why sometimes you'll still see people described as having a fiery temperament. Aristotle's four-element system lasted well into the Middle Ages. There's not much trace of it left now, although if you're looking to find some trace of it, you might be able to find it in the four states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Although it should be said that these are very different concepts. But Aristotle's four-element system, being wrong, couldn't possibly last forever. And by the time we got to the 17th century, something akin to the modern science of chemistry began to emerge. And Durant writes about this in The Age of Louis XIV, the 8th volume. And so I'm going to read a quote from that volume now. Fire was as fascinating to scientists as to dreamers at the hearth. What made a substance burn? How explain those ever-changing tongues of flame? Beautiful, imperious, and terrible. In 1669, a German chemist, Johann Joachim Becher, reduced all elements to two, water and earth. One form of the latter he called oily earth, which he believed present in all combustible bodies. This it was that burned. In the 18th century, Georg Stahl, following this false lead, was to set chemistry askew for decades with his similar theory of phlogiston. Boyle took another cue. Noting that various substances cease to burn in a vacuum, he concluded that there is in the air a little vital quintessence, which serves to the refreshment and restoration of our vital spirits. His younger contemporary, John Mayow, also of the Royal Society, advanced 1647 towards our current theory of fire by positing among the constituents of air a substance that unites with metals when they are calcined, oxidized, and he believed that a similar substance, entering our bodies, changes venous into arterial blood. This was the state of chemistry in the 17th century. Becher's idea of a fire-like element, phlogiston, was not to vanish quickly. In fact, phlogiston as an idea was to last more than a century. Incidentally, the word phlogiston was derived from the word phlox, which was the Greek word for flame, and phlox is our word for flowers who are sometimes flaming red. At this point, the scientific quest to understand and classify fire and combustion became wrapped up with the discovery of oxygen for obvious reasons. And Durant writes about this in the 9th volume. Of early chemistry, Durant says this: Our current explanation of combustion was prepared by the work of Hales, Black, and Scheele on the chemistry of the air. Stephen Hales paved the way by devising a pneumatic trough, or air receptacle, into which gases could be collected in a closed vessel over water. He pointed out that gases, which he called airs, were contained in many solids, and he described air as a fine elastic fluid with particles of a very different nature floating in it. The decomposition of air and water into diverse substances put an end to the age-long conception of air, water, fire, and earth as the four fundamental elements. In the next generation, the experiments of Joseph Black, 1756, proved that one constituent of air was what, after Hales, he called fixed air, i.e., air contained in and removable from solid or liquid substances. We now term it carbon dioxide, or carbonic acid gas. Black further cleared the way to the discovery of oxygen by showing experimentally that this gas is contained in human exhalations. But he still believed in phlogiston, and oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen were still mysteries. Therefore, by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, we can see that this notion, the notion of four fundamental elements, something that had been around for more than 20 centuries, this idea was on the way out, and the idea of chemical compounds like carbon dioxide was on the way in. It's at this point that Karl Wilhelm Scheele begins to take center stage, and of him Durant writes this. In 1775, he sent to the printer a manuscript entitled Chemical Treatise on Air and Fire. Its publication was delayed till 1777, but nearly all the experiments it described had been carried out before 1773. Scheele, while holding till his death the belief in phlogiston, laid down the basic proposition that unpolluted atmosphere is composed of two gases. One of these he named fire air, our oxygen, as the main support of fire. The other he called vitiated air, our nitrogen, as air that has lost fire air. He prepared oxygen in several ways. In one method, he mixed concentrated sulfuric acid with finely ground manganese, heated the mixture in a retort, and collected the resultant gas in a bladder that had been pressed nearly free of air. He found that when the gas so produced was played over a lighted candle, this began to burn with a large flame, and emitted such a bright light that it dazzled the eyes. He concluded that fire air was the gas that supported fire. There is little doubt that he obtained the gas 2 years before Priestley. They were both working at around the same time, but it was Karl Wilhelm Scheele who, in 1772, preceded Joseph Priestley by 2 years in the discovery of oxygen. But it was Priestley who preceded Scheele by 2 years in publishing his findings in 1775. So therefore you have this debate about who should get the credit for the discovery of oxygen. Should it be the person who discovered it, or should it be the person who published their findings first? We should also mention Lavoisier at this point. Antoine-Laurent de Lavoisier originated the name oxygen, which is a combination of two Greek words, oxy meaning acid and gen meaning producer of or born of. The precise date at which Lavoisier coined the name oxygen is unclear. Durant puts it at 1779, but I have also read that it could have been 1777 or 1778. But given this is a Durant channel, we'll go with 1779. Lavoisier was a very important person in the early development of chemistry. He was killed at the age of 50. He was guillotined during the Reign of Terror. There's a lot more to say about Lavoisier and Scheele and Priestley. In fact, Durant dedicates individual sections to each one of them. But when we get to those sections in the series, I'll make individual videos about those three. But that'll have to be for another day. Now that we have some understanding of what fire is and how it was understood historically, how did our prehistoric ancestors learn to harness fire? What are the actual and mythological explanations for that? Well, you'll be unsurprised to learn that Durant has lots of opinions, and so I'm going to give you I'm going to read a quote now from the first volume. This is from the section The Arts of the Stone Age, where he talks about the achievements of our prehistoric ancestors. This is what he has to say. But his great achievement was fire. Darwin has pointed out how the hot lava of volcanoes might have taught men the art of fire. According to Aeschylus, Prometheus established it by igniting a narthex stalk in the burning crater of a volcano on the Isle of Lemnos. When I first read that quote, I was kind of curious about the reference to Darwin, and so I decided to look it up. And at first I thought it might be from The Voyage of the Beagle, and I thought that only because Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, and the Galapagos Islands are very heavily volcanic islands, and that might be the reference to the volcanoes. But actually, I later realized that was a mistake because Darwin doesn't really talk at all about human evolution until we get to The Descent of Man. And so it's actually a quote from The Descent of Man. So I'm going to read what Darwin actually wrote about this subject. So this is Darwin speculating on how early humans may have acquired fire. In breaking flints, as Sir J. Lubbock likewise remarks, sparks would have been emitted, and in grinding them, heat would have been evolved. Thus, the two usual methods of obtaining fire may have originated. The nature of fire would have been known in the many volcanic regions where lava occasionally flows through forests. Any mention of Darwin, of course, naturally raises the question of how fire may have impacted human evolution. This has been a subject of considerable controversy and debate over the years. Insofar as there is an archaeological and anthropological consensus, it seems as if fire usage predates Homo sapiens and goes back all the way to Homo erectus. at least a million years. It seems as if Homo erectus used fires that were already burning and maintained them in order to cook food. Here's a question. Which species was the first to learn how to create fire? Was it Homo erectus or Neanderthals or Homo sapiens? It's an important distinction, right, between learning how to maintain a fire that started by a natural cause like a lightning strike and learning how to start a fire. So which species was it that first learned how to do this? When archaeologists discovered hearths at Neanderthal sites, it suggested fire creation. If Neanderthals were able to create fire, it's probable that they used the strike-a-light method, where you take a piece of flint and you strike it against iron pyrite. Incidentally, note the name pyrite and the use of the pyre from the Greek word for fire. Pyrite, therefore, as we saw earlier on with igneous rocks, could be classified as something like fire rock or firestone. Anyway, as late as the 1990s, it did seem as if there was a lack of archaeological evidence suggesting that the Neanderthals had the ability to create fire. This was particularly true during the glacial periods. This is very odd, because if the Neanderthals had the ability to create fire, you would expect to see more evidence of it during glacial periods and not less evidence. However, in the early 2000s, more sites were discovered, and through microscopic analysis of flint tools, it does now seem as if the Neanderthals did have the ability to create and not just maintain fire. This really shouldn't be surprising, because one of the things that has been consistent over the last sort of 25 years is that the more research that's done on Neanderthals, the more impressive their abilities seem to be. This conclusion, though, raises all kinds of really, to my mind, interesting questions. So, for example, given that Neanderthals predate Homo sapiens, is it possible that Neanderthals knew how to create fire long before Homo sapiens did? And presumably, fire creation had to be discovered on multiple occasions by different bands of Homo sapiens at different times. And given that we know that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacted with each other, is it possible that certain bands of Homo sapiens had to learn fire creation from Neanderthals? Did Neanderthals teach us how to use fire, at least sometimes? The early interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens just seems to me like a very interesting subject. And I wish we knew how those interactions went, or like what those interactions were like in some way, because it's a very intriguing period to me. So Durant wrote about the Neanderthals in this first volume, and I'm going to read you a quote now where he talks about them. But the only thing I would keep in mind is this book came out in 1935, and so some of the dates that he mentions have to be pushed back because there have been new archaeological discoveries suggesting that these things happened earlier than Durant realized in the 1930s. So here's what Durant had to say. Among Neanderthal remains, we find bits of charcoal and charred bones. Man-made fire, then, is at least 40,000 years old. Cro-Magnon man ground stone bowls to hold the grease that he burned to give him light. The lamp, therefore, is also of considerable age. Presumably, it was fire that enabled man to meet the threat of cold from the advancing ice. Fire that let him free to sleep on the earth at night, since animals dreaded the marvel as much as primitive men worshipped it. Fire that conquered the dark and began that lessening of fear which is one of the golden threads in the not quite golden web of history. Fire that created the old and honourable art of cooking, extending the diet of man to 1,000 foods inedible before. Fire that led, at last, to the fusing of metals, and the only real advance in technology from Cro-Magnon days to the Industrial Revolution. So we can say that Neanderthals probably knew how to create fire, but what about modern Homo sapiens? When did we first interact with fire? Presumably our first interactions were as a result of lightning strike or volcanoes or wildfires, that our first interactions were probably accidental. Without having the ability to create fire, we imagine that our prehistoric ancestors tried to maintain existing fires. Their engagement with fire would have probably been very opportunistic. We picture our early ancestors using fires long before they had the ability to tame fire. We know that fires were very common in the savannah during early prehistory, and so it's very likely that our ancestors would have foraged in the aftermath of wildfires, and likely they would have found animals that had been killed in the wildfire and were half cooked. These discoveries may have been the origin of cooking. So what impact did fire have on Homo sapien evolution? As with all these kinds of subjects about human prehistory, it's always very controversial. People have lots of different opinions about these kinds of things. In the video I made From Hunting to Tillage, I read a quote about fire's effect on evolution that Durant had written. And so I'm going to read that quote again because it's relevant to this section. So this is what Durant had to say. The discovery of fire limited this indiscriminate voracity and cooperated with agriculture to free man from the chase. Cooking broke down the cellulose and starch of 1,000 plants indigestible in their raw state, and man turned more and more to cereals and vegetables as his chief reliance. At the same time, cooking, by softening tough foods, reduced the need of chewing, and began that decay of the teeth which is one of the insignia of civilization. Before fire, we would have eaten wild fruits and berries and nuts and seeds and that kind of thing. Insofar as we ate other animals, we would have eaten them raw. We would have broken their bones for the marrow, and we would have drunk their blood. You may think that's disgusting, but remember that blood is a rich source of iron and protein. Dracula was on something. As Durant says, cooking would have increased the variety of Homo sapiens' diets. It would have also killed off germs and parasites. It would have also, by softening the food, lessened chewing, and that would have been a more energy-efficient way of eating. Energy efficiency was a matter of no little importance in human prehistory. As I mentioned in an earlier video, it's possible that using fire to cook food also increased brain size and possibly human intelligence, although this is a very controversial subject. If you're interested in that, I would say go back and watch the video I made on From Hunting to Tillage. Using fire to cook food may have changed human physiology, but it may also have changed human social structures. So it's possible that once we started using fire to cook food, there was a clear distinction between those who went out to hunt and those who stayed home to cook. Although, if it did increase social stratification, it's important to say that social stratification doesn't necessarily mean a decline in social cohesion, because having a campfire at the center of the camp, which everybody sits around, would have probably increased social cohesion within the tribe. It's also possible that having a campfire which everyone sits around increased storytelling, as well as human communication abilities, as well as the ability to pass on knowledge from one member of the group to another. So having a campfire may also have improved both communication and human intelligence. Another way in which fire may have affected Homo sapiens is that fire was the first artificial light. It would have lengthened the day and likely changed human sleep patterns. Human beings are different in that we tend to sleep less than other mammals. You'll notice this for sure if, like me, you own a cat. They tend to sleep all day long. Therefore, shorter sleep hours may have been one of the consequences of the adoption of fire. The adoption of fire also had plenty of other practical uses, and this is what Durant has to say about that. He put the wonder to 1,000 uses. First, perhaps, he made it serve as a torch to conquer his fearsome enemy, the dark. Then he used it for warmth, and moved more freely from his native tropics to less enervating zones, slowly making the planet human. Then he applied it to metals, softening them, tempering them, and combining them into forms stronger and suppler than those in which they had come to his hand. So fire would have been useful for warmth, of course, and this would have helped during the last ice age, especially when human beings started to move into colder climates like Europe. Another way in which fire would have been used is to illuminate caves and illuminate cave walls. This would have helped human beings to clear out wild animals from caves that could have then been used as shelter. So in that sense, fire was really the beginning of what we've come to call domesticity. Fire would have been useful in a whole bunch of other ways too. So we would have used fire to ward off predators. It's hard to imagine this now, but for most of our history, human beings were as much prey as we were predators. We would have also used fire to try and steer animals in certain directions, usually towards well-laid traps. We would have used smoke to signal over long distances. We would have also used smoke as an insect repellent. We would have used fire to harden spears and arrowheads. And finally, we would have probably used fire for cremation of the dead. Fire has also had tremendous religious significance, and Durant writes about this. This is what he says. So beneficent and strange was it that fire always remained a miracle to primitive man, fit to be worshipped as a god. He offered it countless ceremonies of devotion, and made it the centre, or focus, which is Latin for hearth, of his life and home. He carried it carefully with him as he moved from place to place in his wanderings, and would not willingly let it die. Even the Romans punished with death the careless Vestal Virgin who allowed the sacred fire to be extinguished. The hearth being at the center of the home is a concept which is alien to most people today. The center of the home today is probably more likely to be a flat screen TV, but that's interesting in itself because the flat screen TV also just produces like flickering lights. The idea of the hearth being at the physical center of the home lasted until the 12th century when people started to build chimneys at the side of the building, and they did this because moving the chimney to the side of the building produced a much better ventilation for the home. In Greek mythology, Hestia is the goddess of the hearth and associated with fire. When the Romans adopted various Greek deities, they didn't make many changes. This is true with regards to their goddess of the hearth. For the Romans, Hestia became Vesta, and this is why the keepers of the sacred flame are called Vestal Virgins. So far in this video, I've talked a little bit about what fire is and perhaps how it was understood historically, as well as I've talked about how we may have discovered it by accident, accidental lightning strike, or possibly from volcanoes, or from the sparks of flint, or possibly wildfires. But I must confess to you now that all of that is, of course, completely and totally wrong. The truth is, as any right-thinking person knows, that fire was given to humanity as a gift from the gods, or to be more specific, from the Titans, and to be more specific still, from one particular Titan, and that, of course, was Prometheus. If you're wondering what it is that motivated Prometheus to give humanity the gift of fire, well, then you're in luck, because I was lucky enough to overhear a conversation between mighty Zeus and Prometheus himself, where they discussed this very subject. One morning Zeus came to him and said, "O Thunderer, I do not understand your design. You have caused the race of man to appear on earth, but you keep him in ignorance and darkness." "Perhaps you better leave the race of man to me," said Zeus. "What you call ignorance is innocence. What you call darkness is the shadow of my decree. Man is happy now, and he is so framed that he will remain happy unless someone persuades him that he is unhappy. Let us not speak of this again." But Prometheus said, "Look at him, look below. He crouches in caves. He is at the mercy of beasts and weather. He eats his meat raw. If you mean something by this, enlighten me with your wisdom. Tell me why you refuse to give man the gift of fire." Zeus answered, "Do you not know, Prometheus, that every gift brings a penalty? This is the way the fates weave destiny, by which gods also must abide. Man does not have fire, true, nor the crafts which fire teaches. On the other hand, he does not know disease, warfare, old age, or that inward pest called worry. He is happy, I say, happy without fire, and so he shall remain." "Happy as beasts are happy," said Prometheus. "Of what use to make a separate race called man and endow him with a little fur, some wit, and a curious charm of unpredictability, if he must live like this? Why separate him from the beasts at all?" "He has another quality," said Zeus, "the capacity for worship, an aptitude for admiring our power, being puzzled by our riddles, and amazed by our caprice. That is why he was made." "Would not fire, and the graces he can put on with fire, make him more interesting?" "More interesting, perhaps, but infinitely more dangerous. For there is this in man too, a vaunting pride that needs little sustenance to make it swell to a giant's size. Improve his lot, and he will forget that which makes him pleasing, his sense of worship, his humility. He will grow big and poisoned with pride, and fancy himself a god, and before we know it, we shall see him storming Olympus. Enough, Prometheus. I have been patient with you, but do not try me too far. Go now, and trouble me no more with your speculations." So that was a passage from Bernard Eveslyn's great book aimed at young people, which is a retelling of the Greek myths. I think perhaps I am maybe the worst voice actor in England. You probably know the rest of the story. So Prometheus is not convinced by mighty Zeus's explanation. So he goes to Mount Olympus and he steals fire. Usually in the myth, he steals it by hiding it in a narthex plant, which is a particular plant that grows in Greece. And then he heads down to Earth and gives it to humanity. But mankind was frightened by fire. Fire is an ill-natured spirit, a little brother of the sun. For sheer spite, fire makes the shadows dance. Fire is greedy, and you can only feed it twigs, or else it will eat everything in sight, including you. Inevitably, Zeus discovers what's been done against his will, and Prometheus is punished. He's bound to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. Each day, an eagle, which is a symbol of Zeus, comes along and it pecks out Prometheus's liver. Overnight, the liver regenerates, only to be eaten again the next day. This daily routine continues forever, or in some versions of the myth, it continues until he's rescued by Heracles. The story of Prometheus has had a pretty big impact on Western civilization, and as such, Durant mentions it again and again and again throughout the series. The thing about the Prometheus myth is that every generation reinterprets the story in different light. So the Prometheus you get during the Enlightenment is different than the Prometheus that is interpreted during the Romantic movement. There are multiple versions of the Prometheus story. So you have Hesiod's version, which also has a reference to Pandora, and then you have Plato has a reference to Prometheus, and then you have Aeschylus's version, Prometheus Bound, and then Shelley's version, Prometheus Unbound. So Prometheus is first bound and then unbound. And then you have the modern Prometheus, which is, of course, Frankenstein. Now, I'm quite pleased with myself that in a video ostensibly about fire, I've managed to get in a reference to both Dracula and Frankenstein. If I can get like the Wolfman in before the end of the video, then I'm going to be even more pleased with myself. The reason that the Prometheus story keeps coming back again and again and again is because it touches on some pretty fundamental issues of society. It can be interpreted metaphorically, philosophically, and psychologically. The gift of fire to humanity symbolizes new technology, progress, innovation, and advancement. The whole story can be read as a cautionary tale on the need for humanity to handle new technology responsibly. Humanity striving for knowledge has unintended consequences, and the unintended consequences of new technology is the fundamental tension of all technological progress. The fire itself represents consciousness, and learning how to create fire represents humanity's attempt to take over control of nature. Fire, though, is a tool, and like any tool, it is what we make of it. It has a dual nature. It's both creative and destructive, for good or ill. Prometheus himself is often interpreted as a romantic hero. He strives against societal norms. He defies the established order. In this case, Zeus represents the established order. He tries to bring this new technology to humanity, and his hardship benefits others. Therefore, Prometheus is often seen as an existential hero. His absurd daily punishment, his isolation, his alienation, and his suffering also mirror the pain necessary for personal growth. Prometheus wishes to assert agency in an indifferent universe, and by doing so, he hopes to create meaning. If we move away from the mythological interpretations as to where fire came from, and we look at fire's more practical uses, then we can see probably the biggest impact that fire has had is on industrial processes. We have glass making, ceramics, blacksmithing, the forging of metals, the smelting of ores or metallurgy. They all use fire to transform and shape materials. The first industrial use of fire was probably for pottery. Pottery was used for storage and cooking. By some 3000 BC, metalworking had begun, first with copper and bronze, and then later with iron. We see the smelting of lead and silver at around the same time. There was a big expansion with the Greeks and the Romans, and Durant writes about that, and I'm going to read you another quote from this section of the book. The age of metals began not with their discovery, but with their transformation to human purpose by fire and working. Metallurgists believe that the first fusing of copper out of its stony ore came by haphazard when a primeval campfire melted the copper lurking in the rocks that enclosed the flames. Such an event has often been seen at primitive campfires in our own day. Possibly this was the hint which, many times repeated, led early man, so long content with refractory stone, to seek in this malleable metal a substance more easily fashioned into durable weapons and tools. Presumably the metal was first used as it came from the profuse but careless hand of nature, sometimes nearly pure, most often grossly alloyed. Much later, doubtless, apparently about 3500 BC, in the region around the eastern Mediterranean, men discovered the art of smelting, of extracting metals from their ores. Then, towards 1500 BC, as we may judge from the bas-reliefs on the tomb of Rekhmara in Egypt, they proceeded to cast metal, Dropping the molten copper into a clay or sand receptacle, they let it cool into some desired form, like a spearhead or an axe. That process, once discovered, was applied to a great variety of metals and provided man with those doughty elements that were to build his greatest industries and give him the conquest of the earth, the sea, and the air. Perhaps it was because the eastern Mediterranean lands were rich in copper that vigorous new cultures arose in the 4th century BC in Elam, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, and spread thence in all directions to transform the world. Just as metallurgy has shaped industry, fire has shaped history. There were doubtless some great conflagrations that took place in the prehistoric period that we have absolutely no knowledge of at all. We do get some sense of the fires that took place in prehistory through the science of dendrology, or more specifically, the study of tree rings. Regardless, there are more than enough great fires that have taken place over the last 60 centuries, the historical period, for us to be getting on with. Some of the dates of these fires have become so synonymous with fire that they have entered our collective historical consciousness. Here are some of the great fires in human history. Circa 1180 BC, the possibly historical destruction of the city of Troy. It was the ending of Trojan civilization, well, at least until Aeneas founded Rome, which is one of Rome's many great founding myths. Troy was burnt to the ground by the Greeks for Helen, or more realistically, it was burnt to the ground for reasons of geopolitics, so as to allow the Greeks to open up Black Sea trade. 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome, more commonly known as Nero's Fire. The emperor blamed the Christians. Religious minorities are always a useful scapegoat for any disaster. The fire was used as a pretext for their persecution. Although Nero is often portrayed as a monster, in reality he may have done a better job at dealing with the fire than some of his later critics claimed. 1657 AD, the Great Tokyo Fire. Of that fire, Durant wrote this: "The worst of the many fires in Japanese history was that which completely wiped out Edo, Tokyo, in 1657, with the loss of 100,000 lives." When Durant wrote that, in 1935, it was true. Sunday, the 2nd of September 1666, the Great Fire of London. The death toll was light, but it destroyed most of the old city, that part of the city that was within the Roman walls. It started at a bakery in the innocuous-sounding Pudding Lane. Monday, the 14th of September 1812, Moscow burns. Likely the fire was set by the Russians themselves during their retreat after the Battle of Borodino. The blaze was designed to demoralize Napoleon's Grande Armée and force its retreat. It worked. Saturday, the 26th of April 1986, a fire breaks out in Chernobyl, Ukraine, at a nuclear facility. Not so much a traditional fire, it was more of a graphite fire. It released an enormous amount of radioactive material right the way across Ukraine and Belarus. In fact, the radioactive material spread all the way around Europe. When I was a child in the 1990s, I can remember people talking about whether or not radioactive material had reached Britain. After an investigation was completed, they found that it probably had, and it was likely causing deformities in livestock on English and Welsh farms. In 2017, a fire broke out in West London at a place called Grenfell Tower. The tower was covered in highly flammable cladding. It turned out that 72 people died in the fire, most of them poorer people. In 2019, a fire broke out at Notre Dame, the cultural symbol of France, although it was reconstructed by 2024. And when I was writing up notes for this video, it seems as if a fire has broken out in Los Angeles. The Pacific Palisades district of Los Angeles seems to have been almost totally destroyed. As terrible as these fires are, they have generally led to an improvement in safety standards. Lessons have often been learnt. Building codes tend to be of a higher standard than they used to be. We don't use as much thatch and paper and wood in building as we used to. The decline in smoking rates in the 21st century has also led to a decline in house fires. And the big transformation that's taken place is the change over from candlelight to electrification that took place in the 20th century. The transformation from candlelight to electrification took place much later than most people realize. The rural areas of Europe and the United States weren't fully hooked up to the electric grid until the 1960s. My grandmother, who was born in Derbyshire in the 1920s, could remember a time when she was a child when her street was hooked up to the grid for the first time. Electrification and electric light was a big transformation for them. It's hard to imagine this, but for most of human history, the lighting has been either candlelight or torchlight. I also wanted to very briefly mention that, of course, fire has played a very important role in warfare. We've had things like the very mysterious substance known as Greek fire, and later we had gunpowder, which is made out of charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate. In the 19th century, we saw the first creation of high explosives like dynamite. And in the 20th century, we saw the creation of napalm, which is usually associated with the Vietnam War, but was in fact first used at the end of the Second World War against Japan. As terrible as fire can be, we still use it on an almost daily basis. We use things like matches, we use fire for the incineration of waste, for cooking, in use for the internal combustion engine, for heating our homes. Fire is used to heat water, which produces steam, which turns turbines and produces electricity. These are all ways in which we either directly or indirectly still use fire today. The psychological effect of government messaging on the issue of fire has been very successful. In fact, it's probably been too successful. The idea that we should extirpate ourselves from fire altogether is probably wrong. Consider this. When the Europeans first arrived in Australia, they looked at the Aboriginal relationship with fire, and they saw it as a sign that the Aboriginals were primitive. In this regard, they were, I think, well-intentioned, but quite wrong. The Aboriginal people had a much better understanding of the environment of Australia, and they had a much clearer understanding of the necessity of controlled burns. And therefore, they would engage in lots of controlled burns that would release excess fuel and prevent much wider and larger fires from erupting. So what is the conclusion of all of this? Well, for Durant, this section of the book is focused on the 5 foundations of industry, the first of which, of course, is fire. And he's trying to get people to think about both how fire has played an important role in the development of civilization, but also he's trying to get you to think about how often we use fire without ever really thinking about it. Probably you're thinking, well, hold on a minute, this video doesn't do justice to all the different times Durant talks about fire, and you'd be absolutely right about that. Durant mentions fire over 1,000 times during the series, and so I couldn't cover all of it. In fact, there's a whole series of topics and a whole series of notes which I wrote for this video, which I'm just not going to talk about today. So I didn't talk about the Zoroastrians and their relationship with fire. I didn't talk about Swidden and slash and burn agriculture. I didn't talk about pyromaniacs. I didn't talk about arson. I didn't talk about any of these topics, but they'll all have to wait for another day. Okay, so I intend to post the images from the books into the community section. There's a whole bunch of them, and it'll take me years to do it, but I'll gradually do that. So if you're interested in the images from the books, they'll be in the community section of this channel. The next video in this volume will be another one of the foundations of industry, maybe prehistoric tools. If not that, I'll probably do trade and Durant's view on trade because it's quite interesting. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.